Dirt flew as the heavy excavator tore through prime fertile topsoil, the ultimate sin in Oakhaven County. Neighbors leaned against rusted pickup trucks, shaking their heads, chuckling at the sheer lunacy. Abraham was deliberately destroying his own 160-acre farm, carving massive craters into the land his grandfather bled for. Abraham Kelly stood at the edge of the freshly gouged earth, his boots sinking into the damp clay. At 52, he possessed the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent 3 decades fighting the sky. But today he wasn't looking up. His pale blue eyes were fixed strictly on the dirt. A deafening roar echoed across the valley as the 30-ton excavator dug its steel teeth into the middle of his best soybean field, ripping out a trench that was 40 feet wide and 10 feet deep. Oakhaven County was a place anchored in rigid, generational tradition. Here success was measured in straight lines, laser-leveled horizons, and fence-to-fence planting. Every square inch of soil not producing a cash crop was considered wasted money. So when Abraham hired a heavy machinery crew to tear up a full 20% of his inherited arable land, the local rumor mill ignited faster than dry wheat in a lightning storm. Across the property line, separated only by a sagging, barbed wire fence, sat the sprawling 2,000-acre empire of Clayton Hayes. Clayton was everything Abraham wasn't. Loud, heavily leveraged, and ruthlessly ambitious, Clayton drove a pristine King Ranch Ford pickup that rarely saw actual mud. He operated on corporate contracts, relying on genetically modified seeds, heavy chemical fertilizers, and massive deep-well pivot irrigation systems that drained the county aquifer by the millions of gallons. Clayton leaned against the hood of his truck, a mocking grin spreading across his face as he watched the excavator pivot and dump another ton of rich topsoil into a raised berm. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing the local diner to spread the morning's entertainment. "I'm telling you, the man has finally cracked," Clayton bellowed into the receiver, loud enough that the wind carried his voice across the property line. "He's taking grandfathered prime acreage and turning it into a damn resort for frogs. Kelly's Folly, that's what we're going to call it. He's digging ponds, right in the middle of the fields." Clayton wasn't entirely wrong about the optics. To the untrained eye, Abraham's farm looked like a war zone. Instead of preparing the soil for the spring planting, Abraham was carving a massive interconnected network of retention ponds, swales, and contour trenches. He was deliberately breaking the flat grade of his land, creating deep basins, connected by shallow spillways that zigzagged through where his corn and soybeans usually stood. The financial reality, however, was far less amusing than the county gossip. Abraham was operating on a knife's edge. 2 years of erratic weather, a devastating flash flood, followed by a blistering dry spell, had eroded his topsoil and decimated his yields. He was deeply in debt to First National Bank, and his grandfather's 160 acres were one bad harvest away from the auction block. Later that afternoon, a silver sedan bumped its way down Abraham's gravel driveway, dodging the heavy dump trucks hauling earth. Out stepped Tolliver Weaver, the senior loan officer at First National. Tolliver was a nervous man, in his late 30s, clad in a cheap grey suit that always seemed a size too big. He clutched a leather portfolio tightly against his chest as he navigated the rutted dirt toward Abraham. "Abraham." Tolliver called out his voice, cracking slightly over the roar of diesel engines. "Abraham, we need to talk." Abraham signaled the excavator operator to cut the engine. A sudden heavy silence fell over the farm, save for the wind rustling the skeletal remains of last year's corn stalks. "Afternoon, Tolliver," Abraham said, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. "You're a long way from the air conditioning." Tolliver didn't smile. He looked in horror at the massive crater dominating the center of the field. "Abraham, what in God's name are you doing? Your loan application stated the funds were for agricultural infrastructure and irrigation upgrades." You didn't say you were strip mining your own property. It is an irrigation upgrade, Abraham replied, calmly pointing a calloused finger toward the layout. That's a primary retention pond. It holds 3 million gallons. The swales connect to the secondary basins downslope. When the spring rains hit, instead of the water washing my topsoil down into Clayton's ditches, it stops. It sinks. It hydrates the water table directly beneath my crops. Tolliver rubbed his temples, his face pale. You've destroyed at least 30 acres of plantable land. Do you know how the regional board is going to view this? You collateralized this farm based on its yield potential. You've just reduced your production capacity by 20%. Clayton Hayes was just at the bank this morning joking that you were building a moat. Abraham's jaw tightened. Clayton thinks farming is a mining operation. You pump the water out. You strip the nutrients. You dump chemicals and you pray the aquifer doesn't run dry. I checked the historical well data, Tolliver. The county aquifer has dropped 14 feet in the last 5 years. When the water runs out, Clayton's deep wells are going to suck up nothing but sand. I'm not relying on the aquifer anymore. I'm catching the sky. The sky doesn't pay your mortgage. Abraham, Tolliver pleaded, his voice tinged with genuine panic. The board is looking for an excuse to trim high-risk agricultural loans. There's a corporate conglomerate eyeing Oakhaven County buying up foreclosed tracts. If you don't have a bumper crop this fall, I can't protect you. They will take this land. Let them try, Abraham said quietly, turning his back on the banker. Tell the board I'll make my payments. Just let me farm. Over the next 3 weeks, the ridicule reached a fever pitch. At Mabel's Diner, the unofficial headquarters of Oakhaven County's agricultural elite, Kelly's Ponds, became the running joke. Men in seed-brand trucker hats drew crude diagrams on paper napkins, calculating exactly how fast Abraham was going to go bankrupt. Clayton Hayes led the chorus, buying rounds of coffee and openly speculating about how much he would bid on Abraham's land when the bank finally foreclosed. By late April, the excavators departed, leaving behind a scarred alien landscape. Abraham's remaining 130 acres of fields were now framed by deep, dry earthen bowls. Then the spring rains came. It wasn't a gentle, nourishing drizzle. It was a violent torrential deluge that lasted for 3 days. Flash flood warnings blared across the county. In a traditional year, this volume of water would have scoured Abraham's topsoil, washing his expensive seeds and fertilizers into the county drainage ditches. Instead, the water hit Abraham's contour swales. It slowed down. It turned, guided by the earthen berms, and began to fill the massive basins. While Clayton's massive flat fields turned into a muddy, washed-out disaster zone, with water rapidly fleeing into the creeks, Abraham's farm drank. The primary pond filled to the brim, a dark, shimmering oasis in the middle of the farmland. The spillways activated perfectly gently, cascading the overflow into the secondary and tertiary ponds. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, Abraham stood on his back porch, holding a mug of black coffee. His farm looked like a giant puzzle of blue and green. He had captured millions of gallons of free water. But the real test, the one that would determine if he kept his grandfather's legacy or lost it to the bank, was still months away. By early June, the ponds had settled into the landscape, as if they had been there for centuries. Wild grass stabilized the berms, and Abraham efficiently planted his crops a diverse mix of deep-rooted sorghum soybeans and drought-resistant corn along the contours of the swales. Next door, Clayton Hayes had recovered from the spring washouts. Backed by corporate crop insurance, Clayton had simply replanted. His 2,000 acres were a blindingly uniform sea of bright green, mechanically perfect rows stretching to the horizon. Clayton's massive center pivot irrigators stood like dormant metal dinosaurs waiting for the heat. And the heat arrived with a vengeance. The second week of July brought a high-pressure system that parked itself directly over the Midwest. The sky turned a pale, hazy white. The temperature rocketed to 95 degrees, then 98, then 100. Days turned into weeks without a single cloud offering shade, let alone rain. The dirt roads of Oakhaven County turned to fine, choking powder. At first, the county wasn't worried. This was exactly why they had the deep well pumps. Across the valley, the massive diesel engines roared to life, pulling millions of gallons of ancient water from the subterranean aquifer, spraying it in massive arcs over the thirsty crops. Clayton Hayes strutted into Mabel's diner, the bells on the door jingling as he entered. He looked smug, slapping a dusty hat against his thigh. "Hot enough for you boys," he laughed, taking a seat at the main booth. "Good thing my granddaddy had the foresight to drill 500 feet down. My corn is drinking champagne, while the rest of the state is chewing dust." Tolliver Weaver sat 3 booths down, nursing a lukewarm coffee, staring at a stack of manila folders. The bank was in crisis mode. The drought was worse than predicted. "How's Kelly holding up, Clayton?" one of the older farmers asked, stirring sugar into his mug. "His little frog ponds dried up yet?" Clayton smirked. "I haven't checked on the madman. Probably out there with a bucket, trying to save his mud puddles. I give it another week before his crops fry to a crisp. Then I'm calling Weaver over there to talk about property lines." But Abraham wasn't frying. He was witnessing a phenomenon he had only read about in obscure permaculture journals. The heat was brutal, yes. But Abraham's massive retention ponds were doing something extraordinary. The 3 million gallons of water stored in the primary basin, combined with the smaller ponds scattered throughout the acreage, were aggressively hydrating the surrounding soil from below. The water was slowly seeping into the earth, creating a massive underground sponge that reached the deep roots of his crops. More incredibly, the ponds were altering the microclimate of the farm itself. As the scorching summer sun hit the surface of the water, it caused slow evaporation. This invisible mist of moisture drifted across Abraham's crops on the hot wind. While Clayton's corn leaves curled and spiked defensively in the dry, searing air, Abraham's plants remained uncurled, bathed in a localized, humid microclimate. Furthermore, Abraham had set up simple solar-powered pumps to run highly efficient drip lines from the ponds, delivering water directly to the base of the plants without the massive evaporative loss of overhead spraying. By August, the drought escalated from severe to catastrophic. The governor declared a state of emergency. The real disaster struck on a Tuesday afternoon. Clayton Hayes was sitting in his air-conditioned office when his foreman burst through the door, his face pale. "Boss?" The north pivot just shut down. Clayton frowned. "Well, restart the generator, Jimmy." "It's not the generator," Jimmy stammered. "The pump is cavitating. It's pulling air. I checked the south well, too. It's sputtering mud." Clayton's stomach dropped. He rushed out to his truck, tearing across the dirt roads to his primary pump station. He threw the massive steel lever to engage the pump. The heavy diesel engine screamed, whining at a high pitch. Instead of a thick, pressurized stream of clear water, the pipe spat out a violent burst of brown sludge, followed by a hollow, terrifying hiss of air. The aquifer had dropped below the intake pipes. The water was gone. Panic swept through Oakhaven County. Emergency meetings were held at the county courthouse. Farmers who had mocked Abraham months ago were now staring bankruptcy in the face, their fields turning a sickly pale yellow, the stalks crisping in the relentless sun. Amidst the chaos, a sinister plan was forming in the sleek, glass-walled conference rooms of First National Bank's regional headquarters. Tolliver Weaver sat at a polished mahogany table, sweating as his regional manager, a ruthless executive named Sterling Waite Scratch. That name, he was a nameless executive, a ruthless executive with slicked-back hair, tossed a file across the table. "We're calling in the high-risk agricultural loans," the executive said coldly. "Starting with Oakhaven County. AG Corp has offered us a lump sum to buy foreclosed tracts at 80 cents on the dollar. It clears our bad debt and they consolidate the land." "You can't do that," Tolliver protested, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The farmers just need time. If it rains—" "It's not going to rain," the executive snapped. "Look at this file. Abraham Kelly. He took out a commercial loan for irrigation upgrades, but satellite imagery shows he excavated 30 acres of arable land to build stagnant water features. He intentionally destroyed crop-producing acreage. That is a direct violation of the Agricultural Land Preservation Covenant in his mortgage. Call the loan in. Foreclose immediately." "But his fields—" Tolliver started to say, realizing he hadn't actually seen Abraham's fields in 2 months. He had just assumed they were dead like the rest of the county. "Do it, Weaver, or pack your desk." That evening the sky was a bruised, hazy purple as Tolliver Weaver drove his silver sedan down Abraham's dusty road. He felt sick to his stomach. Beside him on the passenger seat sat a heavy manila envelope containing the foreclosure notice. The bank was demanding full repayment of the mortgage within 30 days, an impossible feat, or they would seize the deed. As Tolliver crested the final hill, he instinctively braced himself for the sight of ruined dead crops. Instead, he slammed on the brakes, the sedan skidding on the gravel. He stepped out of the car, his jaw dropping. To his left and right, stretching for miles, Clayton Hayes's massive corporate farm was a graveyard of brown, brittle stalks, the earth cracked like shattered glass. But straight ahead, perfectly framed by the glowing twilight, Abraham Kelly's 160 acres were a vibrant, shocking, impossible emerald green. The pond still held dark, shimmering water, reflecting the sunset, while the tall, thick crops swayed heavily in the hot breeze, heavy with yield. Abraham was standing by his mailbox, leaning on a shovel, watching Tolliver approach. He looked tired, but in his eyes burned the fierce, undeniable light of a man who had gambled his life against nature. And won. Tolliver looked down at the foreclosure notice in his trembling hand, then back up at the impossible oasis. The trap had been sprung, but not the way anyone expected. Dust swirled around Tolliver Weaver's ankles as he stood paralyzed at the edge of Abraham's property. The manila envelope in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Tolliver," Abraham said, stepping out from the shadow of his towering, dark green cornstalks. He wiped sweat from his brow, his face lined with exhaustion, but glowing with a quiet, undeniable triumph. Tolliver swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the shimmering surface of the primary retention pond to the thick, healthy soybeans blanketing the swales. "Abraham, I didn't know. The whole county thinks your farm is dead." "The county only looks at the surface," Abraham replied smoothly, leaning on his shovel. "They don't look at the roots. What's in the envelope?" Tolliver looked down. He couldn't lie to the man who had just pulled off the greatest agricultural miracle Oakhaven County had seen in a century. He handed the envelope over. "It's a foreclosure notice. The bank is calling in the loan. You have 30 days to pay the balance in full or they seize the deed." Abraham pulled the legal document from the envelope, his eyes scanning the dense legalese. His jaw tightened. "I haven't missed a payment. I have a bumper crop right here. In 45 days I'll harvest and pay off 1/3 of the principal. They can't do this." "They are doing it on a technicality," Tolliver explained, his voice trembling with shame. "The Agricultural Land Preservation Covenant in your mortgage. The regional executive claims that by digging those ponds, you deliberately destroyed 20% of the farm's plantable acreage. They're arguing you maliciously devalued the bank's collateral." "Devalued?" Abraham laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. He gestured toward Clayton Hayes's property line, where 2,000 acres of dead brown stalks lay rotting under the relentless sun. My farm is the only one in a 50-mile radius that will yield a harvest this year. Clayton's land is worthless right now. The board doesn't care about logic, Abraham. They care about corporate consolidation. AgCorp is waiting in the wings to buy up the whole valley at a discount. They need you to fail. Abraham folded the paper slowly and tucked it into his shirt pocket. 30 days. My crops won't be dry enough to harvest in 30 days. It's a trap. It is, Tolliver admitted softly. And I am so sorry. News of the bank's impending foreclosure leaked into town the next morning, but it was entirely overshadowed by the sheer disbelief spreading through Oakhaven. Someone had driven past Abraham's farm and seen the impossible, a sea of green amidst an ocean of brown dust. By noon, Mabel's diner was dead silent. The mockery had vanished. In its place was a thick, suffocating brew of envy and desperation. These men were facing ruin. They had trusted the deep wells, and the wells had betrayed them. Abraham had trusted the sky and the dirt, and he was thriving. No one was more desperate than Clayton Hayes. Clayton was drowning in over $10 million of equipment and chemical debt. His corporate masters were already circling, preparing to strip his assets. He had spent his entire life building an empire of scale, mocking Abraham's traditional small-time mentality. Now Abraham's single pond held more liquid wealth than Clayton's entire bank account. That night, a suffocating heat lingered over the valley. Abraham was asleep in his farmhouse when his dog, a grizzled shepherd mix named Barnaby, began barking frantically at the back door. Abraham threw off the sheets, grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. Down by the eastern property line, the wire fence separating his land from Clayton's, he heard the distinct, heavy rumble of a diesel engine. It wasn't a tractor. It sounded like a high-capacity industrial trash pump. Heart pounding, Abraham sprinted through the dark rows of corn, the thick leaves slapping against his jeans. As he breached the clearing near the secondary retention pond, the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness. There, standing in the mud on Abraham's side of the fence, was Clayton Hayes. Two of Clayton's farm hands were dragging a massive 6-inch black polypipe straight into the depths of Abraham's pond. The pipe was connected to a roaring diesel pump mounted on the back of Clayton's King Ranch truck. "Turn it off!" Abraham roared, his voice echoing over the engine. Clayton spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked like a cornered animal. "Back off, Abraham. I just need enough to save my seed corn crop. You have millions of gallons just sitting here. You're stealing my water. Clayton, shut off the pump or I'm calling the sheriff." "It's not your water," Clayton screamed, stepping forward, his fists balled. "It fell from the sky. It's county watershed, you dammed up natural runoff, Kelly. My lawyers looked it up. The Riparian Water Rights Act says you can't hoard natural surface flow. You're killing my farm. Your greed killed your farm." Abraham shot back, not backing down an inch. "You pumped the aquifer dry so you could grow monoculture crops in a desert. I spent my last dime building these swales to catch rain on my own land. Get your pipe out of my pond." One of the farmhands, realizing the legal and moral line they were crossing nervously, stepped back and hit the kill switch on the pump. The engine sputtered and died. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the chorus of cicadas and the heavy breathing of the two rival farmers. "The bank is taking it anyway, Abraham." Clayton spat his shoulders, sagging in defeat. "I heard Weaver talking. You're foreclosed. AgCorp is going to buy this land, fill in your stupid ponds, and bulldoze your house. You're just as dead as I am." "We'll see about that," Abraham said quietly. "Get off my land." Abraham had 21 days left. The crops were maturing beautifully, drawing deep moisture from the subterranean sponge he had created, but they were still weeks away from being ready for the combine. He needed a legal miracle to stall the bank. The miracle came from the unlikeliest of sources, the man who had handed him the death sentence. Tolliver Weaver couldn't sleep. The image of Abraham's green oasis haunted him. The bank's justification for foreclosure that Abraham had destroyed the land's value was a blatant, verifiable lie. The land was infinitely more valuable now, but Tolliver was just a mid-level loan officer. He had no power to override the regional executive board. He needed an authority the bank couldn't ignore. Tolliver spent 3 frantic nights digging through federal agricultural guidelines. He discovered a loophole that Ag Corp and the bank's executives had deliberately ignored. If a farm's infrastructure was certified as a regenerative ecological asset by a recognized federal or state authority, it bypassed standard commercial appraisal metrics. Without telling his bosses, Tolliver placed a call to South Dakota. He reached out to Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, a renowned real-life agroecologist and former USDA scientist who directed the Ecdysis Foundation, an independent research facility dedicated to regenerative agriculture. Dr. Lundgren was legendary for proving that soil health and biodiversity were financially measurable assets. When Tolliver explained the situation, a farmer who had terraformed 160 acres to capture rainfall and was surviving a historic drought while corporate farms collapsed, Dr. Lundgren cancelled his weekend seminars and flew out to Oakhaven County. On day 25 of the bank's countdown, a white, state-issued SUV rolled onto Abraham's farm. Dr. Lundgren, a sharp-eyed scientist with a penchant for dirt, stepped out holding a soil auger and a clipboard. For 12 hours, Dr. Lundgren and his team tested Abraham's property. They measured the volumetric water content of the soil. They tracked the microclimate humidity. They analyzed the nutrient density of the crops. "This is remarkable," Dr. Lundgren said, holding up a core sample of dark, rich, moist earth, completely defying the baked clay of the surrounding county. "You haven't reduced your plantable acreage, Mr. Kelly. You've exponentially increased the drought resilience and yield potential of the remaining 80%. By integrating these retention ponds, you've essentially created a closed-loop hydration system. Your topsoil is regenerating." 2 days later, the Regional Executive Board of First National Bank convened in their glass-walled conference room. The nameless regional manager slammed his fist on the table, demanding Tolliver Weaver produce the final foreclosure deed for the Kelly property to hand over to Ag Corp. Instead, Tolliver stood up. His hands weren't shaking anymore. He tossed a thick-bound document onto the mahogany table. "What is this?" the executive sneered. "That is a certified independent appraisal from Dr. Jonathan Lundgren and the National Resources Conservation Service," Tolliver said, his voice ringing clear across the room. "Under the Federal Environmental Quality Incentives Program, Mr. Kelly's earthworks are officially classified as drought mitigation and watershed protection infrastructure. The covenant violation is void." The executive's face turned purple. "I don't care what some dirt scientist says. We hold the mortgage. And the mortgage is secured by the value of the property," Tolliver countered smoothly. "Turn to page 4. The official appraisal of the Kelly farm has been adjusted. Because it is the only hydraulically independent drought-proof acreage in Oakhaven County, its collateral value hasn't dropped. It has tripled. Foreclosing now under false pretenses of devaluation would be a direct violation of federal lending statutes. If you seize that farm, I will personally hand this report to the State Banking Commission and the local press." The room fell dead silent. The Ag Corp representative, sitting in the corner, quietly packed his briefcase and slipped out the door. The trap was broken. 10 days later, the rain finally returned to Oakhaven County, but for Clayton Hayes and the rest of the corporate giants, it was far too late. Their crops were dust. Abraham Kelly, however, fired up his grandfather's vintage combine harvester. He worked late into the night, the machine's headlights piercing the darkness, as he pulled in the largest, healthiest yield his family had ever seen. Because the regional supply had been utterly decimated by the drought, commodity prices skyrocketed. Abraham sold his drought-resistant corn and soybeans at a massive premium. The next week, Abraham walked into First National Bank. He didn't ask for Tolliver Weaver's office. He walked straight to the teller and slapped down a cashier's check that covered the entire remaining principal of his mortgage. The farm was his, free and clear. In the aftermath, the landscape of Oakhaven County shifted forever. Clayton Hayes declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy. His massive tractors were auctioned off, and the bank seized his 2,000 acres of ruined earth. But Abraham wasn't interested in revenge. Using the excess profits from his miraculous harvest, Abraham bought a 50-acre buffer zone of Clayton's old land. The heavy excavators returned the following spring. But this time, the neighbors didn't lean against their trucks and laugh. They stood at the fence line in quiet reverence, watching Abraham Kelly dig more ponds, taking notes, hoping to learn how to catch the sky. If this story of resilience and outsmarting the system inspired you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that true innovation often starts with a little dirt. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories of people who dared to defy the odds and change their world. Drop a comment below. Would you have risked it all like Abraham did? See you in the next video.